with our two missionaries in Kenya, Debbie and Paul Robinson. It's through them that I became acquainted with Scott and learned about his faith and about his honesty and about his character. And based upon that, I said, wow, this is a great man to come speak to our Pancake Breakfast. The relationship with Kenya is really important for us as a church because we support them strongly. Debbie and Paul have an orphanage there. They have a Feeding 500 program where they feed 500 children every Saturday. And they're building a new school, of which we're a major contributor to the new high school. And this month marks the 10th anniversary of their mission in Kenya and also the grand opening of the new high school. So it's really a great celebration. And in fact, a few of us are actually going to Kenya this month to be part of that celebration. And many of you also make financial contributions to support the children over there and have also supported the building of that school, which is outstanding. And the new school is being called Celebration High School, really in the honor of the contributions that we've made. So it's really fantastic. Currently, Scott resides in Winter Garden with his wife Judy, and Judy is in the back there. And I think now Scott's primarily a keynote speaker and someone who works with corporations to improve business ethics and help work on strategic focus for corporations, based upon his many years of leadership and experiences in the military. After reading his book, Flight Path, Son of Africa to Warrior Diplomat, which is this book here, and I read this after I'd already invited him, and I'd already learned more about him through this book. But the book covers his life experiences, service to our country, and lessons learned in context with the global history from the 1950s through the 2016. That's a great period of time. And again, some of us older people, and I'm probably just a few years more than Scott, but living through the periods with the conflicts in Africa, Iraq, the different presidential administrations. It's great to see his perspective and how he lived through that because he was a major part of that history-making period. Scott was spent nearly half his life in Africa and the Middle East, and of course has a deep understanding of Africa and Kenya in particular. As a missionary kid in Africa, Scott was told he would never amount to much, and during the Congo crisis in the early 1960s, his family was evacuated 3 times and relocating in Kenya after the third evacuation. He went on to become a decorated Air Force fighter pilot and Major General, and also a White House Fellow, which is kind of amazing to be a White House Fellow in the military, and it's a great honor for that. He survived terrorist attacks. He helped lead the hunt for Osama bin Laden. He addressed the 2008 National Democratic Convention and became President Obama's special envoy to Sudan, and then, of course, became U.S. ambassador to Kenya. So please welcome Scott Gration. And
well, thank you very much, Ted. Appreciate that kind introduction. Sometimes it'd be nice if my mom was here. She would appreciate it, and she would also believe it. But this is a great morning. Thank you again to the people in the back who did all the cooking. Pancakes were great. This has been a superb event already, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here. As was said, Debbie and Paul are good friends, and Judy will probably tell a little bit more about it in the Q&A period, but it's been wonderful to see what they're doing, and it wouldn't be possible without the support of Celebration. You've done a tremendous job in encouraging them and supporting them and making their work go forward. And as somebody who watched it on the ground in Mombasa, it's just a pleasure to make the connection between that effort and what you're doing here. So this morning, I want to talk a little bit about what I've been doing. And first of all, let me just say that all these stories that I'll be telling this morning are in the book, and plus a lot more. And so if you're interested in having a look at more stories, I'll be available to sign those books afterwards. You know, we want to start talking today about three things. But the first thing is making your life's priorities the priority, doing the right things. I learned about this the hard way. It was a beautiful day in Arizona, and I had just taken off that morning with a flight of 4, and we'd done a bombing mission on a realistic, full-scale mock-up in southern Arizona. And this afternoon, I would be flying from Phoenix to San Antonio. And it was a fun time. It would be a relaxed time. It would be a cross-country time. And we'd be flying 2 of these fighters called the F-5. And my job would be to be the instructor pilot and the safety observer. The guy in the front cockpit would be studying for his instrument check, so his head would be inside the cockpit. My job would be to make sure that we didn't bump into anything harder than a cloud. So it would be a fun trip. As we got up to altitude, we had puffy clouds all around us. And they were white and beautiful, and as the sun was setting behind us, there was a little orange tint on those clouds, and they looked very, very nice. But as we approached San Antonio, I could see that they were turning black, dark, thunderstorms. And as the sun began to set, they even became darker. I moved into what we call close position, or close formation. That's 3 feet away, wingtip clearance. As we started down, we were going about 300 miles an hour in our descent, which is normal procedure. And then as we got below where the sun was, it became very, very dark. And I had to work really hard to stay in position. I was flying off of a red light on the tail and a red light on the wing and the rotating beacons that were lighting up the airplane. As we went down further, we went into a very wet thunderstorm. And there were streaks of rain just coming by my canopy on the outside. And it became very, very difficult to see, and I had to move even closer. And I was so close that if I had moved closer, I could have a midder. And if I moved away even inches, I would have lost sight of the airplane. And I worked hard, and it took all the concentration that I could muster and all the flying skills to just stay glued in that position as we went down. I knew that at 4,000 feet, we'd be doing a left turn. And so I prepared for that. And again, just working hard to stay in formation, looking at that airplane, not daring to look inside my cockpit, but using that airplane as my guide to stay in tight formation. Poof! The airplane was there a second ago and it was gone. So I rolled out of this turn that I thought we were in and pulled to stop my descent. I transitioned back inside my cockpit and I couldn't believe what I saw. There was my attitude indicator saying that I was on my back, pointing down, 60 degrees nose low. Airspeed was increasing, the altimeter was unwinding, and then I broke out of the clouds and I saw the lights of San Antonio rushing up at me. Well, immediately when I saw this picture, I yanked the throttles to idle and rolled wings level on the attitude indicator and pulled as hard as I could. As the lights came up, I knew I was going to die. Well, a miracle happened that night, and I pulled out between a farmhouse and a row of trees, 500 miles an hour plus, about 200 feet above the ground. I should have been a fireball. A miracle happened. The altimeter kept winding down as I bottomed out and climbed back up into the clouds. That's how fast and how hard I was going down. And that night, as I tried to sleep, I had a hard time sleeping. I could just, every time I closed my eyes, I could see in slow motion those lights coming up and my airplane screaming toward the ground. Altimeter unwinding, airspeed increasing, totally out of control. But when I thought about it, I said, a miracle did happen. My life was spared. But what if I died that night? Well, I know my wife and family would have been very sad. My squadron buds would have missed me. And the wing probably would have had a very nice service to get closure for my colleagues. But as I thought about this, I said, I need to change myself. Because my gravestone would have looked like this. Scott Gration. The next line, it would have said 1951 to 1979, and there would have been a little dash in between the birth date and death date, and that little dash would be the significance of my walk here on earth. And I realized that my dash was all about me. I leave an office that was filled with accolades and plaques and trophies and pictures. I'd been Junior Officer of the Year, Instructor Pilot of the Year, and one of the JC's 10 Outstanding Young Men of America. But was any of this important? Did it matter? Would it live on beyond 1979? Was I making a difference in the world? And I came to realize I needed a new definition of success. I needed to live life outside of myself. I needed to have eternal priorities and a God-centered walk. All this had to change. Because just having an impressive resume is not very important. And I had a very impressive resume. I joined the Air Force right after college, draft number very low, and I worked hard to be the best fighter pilot that the Air Force had. I worked hard, and my personal focus was on achievement. My professional goals were accomplishment and being the best. But this really wasn't that important. And I began to think of situations outside of myself. Situations where I could make a contribution to the world. And about that time, I heard about Uganda. Idi Amin was leaving, and he had killed about 600,000 people. Aspirin cost $5 a piece. Electricity was intermittent, and water was very, very scarce. And it had been these Ugandan people 15 years earlier that had welcomed us, gave us clothes, gave us food when we lost everything, when we evacuated from Congo. And I knew that with my new attitude, I had to do something for them. I had to do something outside of myself. But my transition to Kampala wasn't very easy. I'd bought tools and everything, and I took this really small airplane into Entebbe. And when I landed, I saw guns and soldiers and tents all over. When I went to pick up my tools and my clothing, I saw that my tools had been confiscated, stolen. And the building was a wreck. Windows had been blown out. There was a 707 sitting on the side of the ramp, the engine blown off and shrapnel through the whole thing. And I said, what have I gotten myself into? And then I went to Mengo Hospital. And this is where I would spend the next 5 weeks. Mengo was a beautiful place, but it too didn't have very much equipment. And when I got my little room on the side of the tuberculosis ward, I heard gunfire and shooting and people screaming, and I moved my bed under the window, figuring that if a bullet came in, that was probably the safest place for me to be. And I was not happy. I didn't have any tools. I was alone in the country. There was 13 white guys in Kampala, and I was just one of them. And then the next morning, I walked up the hill, and I passed these 2 little kids. And I realized that they had never tasted salt or sugar or flour. They had existed and subsisted on cassava roots and matoke bananas and groundnuts. Why was I complaining about my situation? They had to stay here. I could leave after 5 weeks. And then I went up to see Dr. Musaba. Dr. Musaba had a practice in Germany, a good practice. But he was here operating sometimes with razor blades instead of scalpels. People would pay for surgeries with water instead of money. And he was delivering about 30 babies a day and 158 people in beds. He himself. And soldiers would come running through with guns blazing and looking for food and looking for drugs and checking on their buddies. And we would have to go hide in the cornfield up behind the hospital. And one day when we were hiding there, waiting for the soldiers to leave, I said to Dr. Masaba, why are you here? Why aren't you in Germany? You speak German, you had a practice, you were doing well. He said, when I found out they didn't have a doctor, I realized if I didn't come back, who would take care of my people? That's what servant leadership is all about. It's not about the glory and fame that comes with leadership, it's about service. It's about making a difference. And I learned a heck of a lot from Dr. Masaba and his attitude. And on Sundays, I would go to the top of the hill, St. Paul's Cathedral in Embarumby Hill. And it's here where I learned about the resilience of the Ugandan people. I would listen to the speakers talk about forgetting the past. How can you forget the past where 600,000 people have been killed and the church has been persecuted? In some cases, the church would be burned down with people inside. And I heard them talking about looking forward and being thankful for God's blessing. And then I heard something that I couldn't understand. I heard them say that people had to forgive Idi Amin and the henchmen who had wreaked so much havoc over the country. And I said, how can people forgive when they've been so persecuted, when they've lost so many family members? And it was a real big lesson for me. And I experienced another situation that made me take a look at my dash in 1996. I was the commander of the operations group, and I was responsible for enforcing the UN-mandated no-fly zone over southern Iraq. I was over there by myself. My family was still back in Springfield, Virginia. And one night, as I was preparing for bed, I was walking to my bed when there was a bright orange, yellowish flash, followed by a thunderous boom. I fell to the floor. I knew what had happened. I was waiting for the next blast. When my eyes got used to the darkness, I felt glass all over the floor, and I could see the twisted frame of my window lying to my side. The TV screen was shattered, and across on the opposite wall, pieces of glass were embedded like darts on a dartboard. I fumbled around and found a flight suit and put it on, and I couldn't find any socks, and I just put on my boots, and I went out to try to help. They were pulling airmen out of Building 131. The blast had taken off the whole front side, and I helped carry people to the clinic. Young men, bloody. In a few hours, we figured out that we had lost 19 people, and the doctors worked frantically to save lives. Of these 19, 18 of them worked directly for me. And it was a poignant reminder that life is precious, and we need to take advantage of every minute. It was also a poignant reminder that freedom's not free. I saw this again, the devastating effect of terrorism when I was in my office in the Pentagon. And during that experience, the third hijacked airplane hit about a few hundred yards from my office. Smoke filled the corridors, and sirens went off, and people tried to help the wounded and evacuate the building. And these experiences that I went through with terrorism and close loss of life around me, and coming close myself to losing my life, showed me that dash is critical. We don't control the beginning And we don't even control the end, but we do control the dash. And I realized through this experience that I needed to have my priorities as the priority. I had been working hard to do things for myself, and it was insidious. I'm the kind of personality that gets up and tries hard, works hard, and it's easy for other things to get out of the way. And I realized through all these experiences that while it's important to do the right things, and we have to do that, it's also important to do the right things right. Execution style points really do matter. It really does matter sometimes how we do things as much as what we do. Amen. Keeping things in balance, having the right priorities, and having a relationship with God and a relationship with your family that's meaningful. And I learned about this over and over again because it was hard for me to balance family time with work time. And my wife had to remind me often that I had to do that. You know, our love story started early. It was in 1954 when Judy's mom and dad came down to visit us in Congo. My parents were there as missionary teachers. We went over in 1953. Judy was just a year old. And they tell us that she was in a playpen throwing toys out, and I would give them back to her. And that's where it all started. Unfortunately, Judy's dad died when she was 5, and her mom went off to Kenya and stayed there as a missionary teacher at a missionary boarding school called Rift Valley Academy. And one morning, as we were living in Congo, the situation was to become intense. Congo got its independence in June 30th, 1960, and we had to evacuate a couple times, but this was 1964. The rebels had taken over Stanleyville. They were capturing people and killing them, and it was a terrible situation. And one morning we heard over our shortwave radio that all expatriates had to leave immediately. That came from the governments of England and European capitals, and our government was saying we had to get out of the country. My parents that night gathered everything together that they thought was important and put it in the car. We said goodbye to our African colleagues and me to my dog that was only there, I only had for about 14 days. And we took off. And after 27 hours, we were finally able to leave the country. But not before Congolese soldiers and customs officials had confiscated everything we owned. We left with our car and the clothes on our backs. And it taught me that possessions aren't that important. Because I learned that day that what I have in my head and what I have in my heart, nobody can take away from me. And I learned at an early age, 13 years old, that it was important for me to learn skills and to get education. I didn't do very well at getting the education. I was a very poor student. But I did learn a lot of skills. And even more importantly, I learned about the heart. That is your relationship with God and your relationship with family and friends that were critical. In fact is, I've learned over the years that when people are coming to the end of their life, and if you watch the funeral of George Bush, H.W. Bush, you heard family and friends like Mr. Baker were important. Why wait until you're dead and almost dying? You should have your family and your relationship with God as a priority in your prime of life. And I learned that through this experience that possessions are not as important as those lasting relationships and what you put in your mind. Well, it was interesting. We went to Kajabi, where Judy was, and our relationship started again. And we would go out as our families and get Christmas trees. And then when Judy was in nurses training, her mom died. Was killed in a car accident in Kenya. and my parents became her guardian. So when we got married, it was a pretty unique situation when Dad walked Judy down the aisle, gave her away to me, and I left as my own brother-in-law, in addition to being a husband. But that was a long time ago, 4 kids and 8 grandkids, and it's been a wonderful life. But she's the one that's been able to help me to keep priorities, to keep those execution style points where they need to be. So I get a 10 for execution in addition to a 10 for the things I did. So I learned that it's important to do the right things. It's important to do the right things right. But sometimes when you're trying your best to do the right, things go wrong. Terribly wrong. And I learned about this. I was the ambassador to Kenya. It was my dream job. I spoke Swahili. I knew the people. I knew the culture. Judy had been born in Nairobi. We loved being back. I'd flown 2 years with the Kenya Air Force. I knew a lot of people. I was perfect for that job. I could represent America. And not only that, we were having trouble with security. I knew about security, 32 years in the military. We were doing humanitarian projects. I'd been CEO of a company trying to eliminate extreme poverty, and I'd been CEO of a company putting clean water around the world. I knew about projects that America could help with. It was a perfect job. And I loved every minute. And while I know that I made some mistakes in my zeal to fix the security situation and to help healthcare throughout Kenya, and even to make the embassy run a little bit smoother, more efficiently and more effectively, I wasn't ready for the downturn in my political career. Up until this point, I'd been recognized as a very strong leader, an efficient manager. But it all ended one day after I'd been ambassador for about 18 months. I walked into my conference room and took my chair at the end of the table. On this side was my senior staff. On the other side was representatives of the State Department's Office of Inspector General. I gave an opening comment and welcomed them there and said we were happy to hear about what they could tell us so that we could improve our operations. And then the chief inspector stood up and instead of it being a report about the last 5 years since our last inspection, it was a targeted attack on me, my character, my leadership skills, the embassy morale. And it felt like I had been hit with a baseball bat. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. My heart was pounding, and I wanted to just say, who are you talking about? It was a very tough time. And after that experience, I left the room and I said, this has been a mistake. Let me write my report and reclama. And they gave me 2 weeks to submit my answers. But 3 days after the Inspector General team left, I got a call from the Chief of Staff of the Department of State, and it said, "You're fired." And I said, "But you haven't even listened to my side of the story. I haven't had an opportunity to confront my accusers. And how can this happen? Even a common criminal gets to have their day in court and to have their side of the story heard." And I said, these statements and allegations are not even close to being true. Well, there was a big investigation, and 3 months later, I was totally exonerated. But I already lost my job. I was sitting there, and on the internet were all these egregious falsehoods about me using my personal email to move classified information. Sound familiar? there were stories about me using my position as the ambassador for my personal gain. These were all false. But they continued to be on the internet. And I was depressed, and I was angry, and I couldn't believe this was happening to me. I'd wake up every day just wondering, how can people lie? How can people do those things that are so unjust? And for 3 years, I was drinking poison and ruining my life, hoping that other people would suffer. And it was hard. And it stopped my mobility. It hampered my thoughts. It affected everything I did for 3 years. And then I was reading a prayer that was written for me 800 years ago. You probably heard about this prayer. It says, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. And it goes on to say that it is in giving that we receive, and it is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it began to make sense to me a little bit. And then I read this thing that I had rehearsed and recounted so many times, the Lord's Prayer. And it told us that, give us this day our daily bread and forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who have trespassed against us. There was nothing in there about waiting until somebody said they're sorry. There was nothing in there that said people have to be sorry for what they did. It just says you have to forgive. And my mind went back to the Ugandans, how they were forgiving Idi Amin, how they were forgiving henchmen who had taken somebody from almost every family. And I realized that it wasn't the lies and the falsehoods and those allegations that were totally untrue that were hurting me. It was my attitude toward these. And I learned that your reputation is important, and what people think you are is important, but it's not half as important as who you are, your character, your integrity. And your integrity is so important. And it really helped me get through this. Integrity is doing what's right when no one's looking. And nobody can give you integrity, you have to live it. And nobody can take your integrity, you have to give it. And I learned through this experience that if you have integrity, nothing else matters. And similarly, if you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. And I learned some very important lessons, and I decided to be better and not bitter. And it was as if I was a ship that had an anchor that was stuck in those rocks, and it was keeping me around the rocks. And when I forgave, it didn't matter anymore what those people did with me. When I cut that anchor, the anchor still stayed in those rocks, but my ship was free to move on, to move forward to a different destination. That's what forgiveness does. That's what forgiveness did for me. It allowed me not to worry anymore about what was done to me. It allowed me to move on. It allowed me to forget. It allowed me to remember the blessings that I had, not the injustices that I figured out, or that had happened to me. So, this morning, we've talked a little bit about doing things right, about having your priorities right, and making those priorities the priority every day. We've learned a little bit about doing things right by having the right balance, by having a relationship with God, eternal priorities, a definition of success that includes other people, not just yourself. We learned that you have to have integrity. You have to have character. We also learned that things sometimes do go wrong. Whether it's a divorce or whether it's a business situation, things happen. And sometimes these things aren't fair. And sometimes you just have to let God work those injustices. And you have to forgive. And you have to move on. You know, we control our dash. We're the ones that make it significant. We're the ones that control our legacy so that when you have that birth date and the death date, that what you did on earth lives on. Sort of what Debbie and Paul are doing in Mombasa. Sort of what all you are doing with your families. You know, I wouldn't want to relive that experience of 30 seconds over San Antonio where I almost lost my life. I wouldn't want to relive those terrorists bombing our barracks in Khobar where I lost 18 men that night. I wouldn't want to be in the Pentagon again when an airplane hit it and 189 people had their dashes terminated at 9:36 a.m. I wouldn't want to lose everything we owned and be left with just the clothes on my back again. And I certainly wouldn't want to be fired again from a dream job. But all those experiences helped me to stay focused on the right thing. They were reorienting events, and events that made a difference in my life. And maybe I'm not that smart, and maybe I need to have the big 2x4 beat me up. But they were important events. They were life-changing events. I learned that we are in control of our dash. We give it significance. So today, as you depart, I hope that you remember to work on the dash, to think about your family, your friends, and God-given priorities and relationships with God and friends, because you control your dash. It's your life. Make it count. Thank you. Have a little bit of time for questions. I think, are you out of time, or do you? I'll be happy to take some questions. And and I can also have my wife come up and talk a little bit about the ministry that you support. And
Just for a minute, and we'll take a few Q&As, and we won't keep you too long. It's still not 9:30 yet, so we still got everybody to rush Saturday morning. I mean, I know the wash is ready to put the dryer now, but let's take a couple of Q&As. We have Judy here.
I'm going to have Judy start out and just tell you a little bit about the ministry that's down there.
Hi. Thank you all for coming today. It was fun to be with you and to get to know some of you and talk with you. And I did want to tell you just a little bit about our relationship with Debbie and Paul. The last three years or so, we have been living in Mombasa, Kenya. And we lived about 20 minutes from Debbie and Paul. And I first met Debbie in a ladies' Bible study. And we just became very, very good friends and were kindred spirits. I have been to their mission work. I have helped feed the 500 children, which is one of the most amazing things I've done in my life. Completely organized. You know, the little ones are all lined up first in a great little line, and then the little bit older ones come through, and I got to ladle, beans out of the hugest pot I've ever seen, big as those tables, bigger than those tables, full of beans and rice. And so I've experienced their work, and they're just so suited to what they do. One day, Debbie said, Judy, I've really been praying, and I really think that you should help teach a women's retreat that I want to do. And I looked at her, I have done a bit of speaking, but never to a crowd like that speaks only Swahili. So I speak a little bit of Swahili, but not enough to do a whole talk. But anyway, God said, Judy, go do it. So I got to help lead a women's retreat at her church, which was just one of the best blessings of my life. So anyway, we think that they are incredibly suited to what they're doing, and Debbie has always been a huge encouragement to both of us, and we love them dearly. So it's fun to be here at this church, and thank you guys for supporting them. It is an exciting thing they're doing.